So, welcome everyone. Here we are, Saturday, May the 9th, and we're moving towards the end of our retreat period with Ajahn Sona. I see a few more old friends showing up each day in the chat here. Good morning, Shirley. Good to see you from Calgary. And Dantika's here, and Marianne, and Jid. So, it's a beautiful sunny day here in White Salmon. And the forecast says we might break 80 degrees for the first time this year, which would be nice. As soon as I'm done here this morning, I'm going to get out and hit the trail. We live right next to a wonderful patch of land called Burgoyne Mountain. And there's a private ranch, but trails are on it that the community can use. And they've been closed for the last few weeks because too many people were using them in an effort to support keeping the spread of the coronavirus down. The landowners posted some signs, and people were pretty good at obeying their wishes. So the last few weeks have just been blissfully quiet. But the downside of it for me is I lost access to some of my favorite and most convenient hiking trails. So I have several loops just outside of our door here. I can jump on the trail and head in several directions and see Mount Adams and Mount Hood and blue sky and birds and wildflowers, beautiful oak trees, evergreens, and the Columbia River as it flows through the gorge down towards the ocean. So quite a wonderful resource for some exercise and sunlight and reconnecting with nature. So healthy and refreshing. So I'm looking forward to that today, as soon as this is all done. And then it'd be time for our meal offering, and then back to retreat and retreat prep. So good to see you all 82 of you joining us. Last night, Ajahn gave the first of his talks on the last section of the Satipatthana, mindfulness of Dhamma categories, as he likes to say, drop-down menus, or mindfulness of Dhammas, it's referred to in other places. And as predicted, because I've known Ajahn for several years, he's offered some guidance in how to simplify approaching that and make it very practical for someone who's engaging in the practice. And namely, he honed in on the 5 hindrances and the 7 factors of awakening, though he didn't even make it all the way through the 5 hindrances. He hit the chief 2, sometimes called greed and hatred. In many translations in the suttas, it's referred to covet. I've already done with this word, covetousness and grief in regard to the world. And those are 2 of the big problems we have in relating to the world. So I imagine tonight he'll flush out the hindrances, but probably spend more time on the positive factors of the bojjhangas, known as the 7 factors of awakening or enlightenment factors. So, and this is according to Ajahn's teaching, and I think it's a very good and practical interpretation of this. This is the reason that we engage in the Satipatthana, as I've said over and over in these little Q&A sessions, and also in the tea time Q&A sessions. We need to take to heart Ajahn's encouragement, how this fits within the Eightfold Path, and how Satipatthana is really giving us a way to operationalize and put into practice right effort at the support of cultivating the path and also cultivating the eighth factor of sama samadhi. So, and you don't get to sama samadhi, not in its canonical meaning or in its fullest sense, like you don't accomplish sama samadhi without overcoming the hindrances. And Ajahn gave very strong encouragement to be conversant with this teaching on the five hindrances. One needs to be well versed in. He said, not just, it's not the kind of thing that that you should have to Google. You should develop an intimate knowledge of this. And I like that he gave a little bit of time to discouraging people from getting hung up on the language of the translators, and not being overly literal about these teachings. I know myself, I kind of tend in that way, and it took a period of time to see some of the folly in that. This kind of desire would come up in me from time to time, or doubt would come up in me from time to time, wondering if I was missing something. And for sure I was. Like, if there's doubt or there's confusion, you are missing something. But I would go back to the books, which in and of itself is not wrong. I mean, we do want to spend time trying to understand the texts with a direct engagement with them, also reading maybe commentaries written by people that have spent more time studying the text. But you do have to be careful about some of those writings, because it does attract the Dhamma geeks. It does attract one of a more literal and scholarly mind sometimes. And part of what they find interesting in the suttas is a little bit aside and sometimes completely divorced from this kind of more fundamental effort of putting the Dhamma into practice to transform our life. And as Ajahn sort of made very emphatically, to change how you feel. At one point in his talk, he says, how do you know that this is working? You feel different. You feel different. And he even surprisingly sort of says, it's not about clear thinking and a clear mind. That will come along for the ride. That's one of the qualities that will be developed. But really what we're after here is feeling different. And in particular, being released from the afflictive emotions and feeling of, I talk about it to myself as a feeling of lack, the feeling of incompleteness, the feeling of not being free, feeling burdened. There's a sense of weight that should lift as practice comes together. And maybe in the early stages and very fleeting moments, but over time, this should be changing the way you feel about yourself and the world and your relationship to others. So I'd like to give a strong encouragement for not thinking that the more fundamental problem in practice is not understanding the translations or the technical meanings of these terms. They should be investigated. But engage in this creative effort to map those to your experience in life. Maybe even as a project, just come up with your own terms for these. I've had a lot of discussions with people before who don't like the translation of greed. Like, we talk about this 3-part classification of Dhamma: greed, hatred, and delusion. And that word greed isn't very meaningful to some people. And my invitation is, come up with your own. go to the text, try to get clear about what the Buddha's talking about there, and then look at your own mind, and with the hypothesis that you are not other, you are subject to this. Like if you can witness the symptomology of a person stuck in samsara still suffering, then it's a reasonable hypothesis that greed, hatred, and delusion are still blowing you around and playing a very large role in your life and how it is that you relate to your conscious experience as a human being. I think of this sometimes as mapping the Dhamma. Like we study the text, we listen to our teachers, we take that in and contemplate it. But then through the cultivation of mindfulness and awareness and this creative investigation of Dhamma, we engage in the process of mapping that to our own experience. And this is critical in relationship to these 5 hindrances. Theoretically, these are the things that are nourishing defilements. These are the things that are nourishing negative emotional experiences: greed, hatred, delusion, confusion, a kind of identification with the self, the delusion of unreasonable notions of permanence and certainty in an uncertain, impermanent world. These are the nutriments. As they arise and we allow them to abide and we allow those habits to kind of persist in ourselves, they are feeding the roots of greed, hatred, and delusion. And we need to be able to sort of know and sense that, and sensitize ourselves to the presence of these things. And it can be a nice experiment, just to come up with your own language for these things as we study them and as we map them into our experience. But more important than language is the ability to apprehend those in our experience itself, and then developing sort of tools to undermine them, to resolve them, to overcome them, even if it's brief or temporary. And much of effective meditation is the job of identifying and resolving these. And it's not insurmountable. I mean, if we have the faith to meditate, oftentimes, and a little bit of skill in focusing the mind on skillful objects, like the breath or loving kindness or something, these hindrances just largely fall away as we direct ourselves to meditation. And if the meditation develops in a very strong form, they're suppressed, like placing a large, heavy object on the front lawn. The bigger the object, the heavier the object, the longer it sits there, the more the grass is flattened and suppressed. And even though if we remove that, the grass doesn't just leap back into its former position. The conditions for doing so have been suppressed, have been weakened. The roots are still there, as are the roots of the hindrances until the practice is really full and complete. But they're suppressed. And we go through this experiment over and over again of noticing hindrances, resolving them, actively suppressing them through the cultivation of skillful states of mind. And that sort of practice back and forth teaches us a lot about the nature of mind, the nature of hindrances, the nature of skillful qualities of mind. And it's a big part of practice. As the hindrances and the influence of them cease, then these beautiful qualities of the factors of awakening, grow and can mature. And that is the strength of heart. That's one way of defining what I refer to as strength of heart. That's the strength of heart that one needs to make the stronger kind of transformations that Dhamma practice affords us. So yeah, just this is a little morning reflection for everyone. Don't be overly literal. Don't think that the problem is lost in translation in a book or embedded in the word. It's the lost translation is that kind of mapping process that happens in one's own heart and mind. And so take up that process, and even if you've been practicing for years, there's oftentimes more to learn, more clarity that can be developed around these dynamics of the mind. Hatred is rather bold and fairly easy to notice. Greed a little more difficult. Sloth and torpor, one of the common translations. I like lethargy because sloth and torpor. Not really sure I've ever come across those words outside of a Theravadan Buddhist context. So they don't pack a whole lot of meaning for me. And they remain abstract and technical on some level. But I think of that as a lethargy of mind, lassitude, It's that mind that doesn't really want to do what it needs to do. It's the mind that can't summon the requisite energy and motivation to engage. And there's a whole spectrum of how that particular hindrance manifests. One very sort of subtle form is like you're meditating, and this is especially problematic for somebody who's been meditating a long time and has a strong habit of meditating. It's easy just to fall back to the habit and to lose this kind of willingness to really creatively engage, sincerely engage with the mind. We oftentimes, out of a certain amount of laziness, just fall back to our commitment to sit for certain periods of time, our commitment to stay with the breath. But it takes more than that to really practice effectively. And we can't always be pushing ourselves, but there has to be this factor of investigation of dhammas and a kind of sincerity to kind of creatively engage with the mind, to understand the bigger project of overcoming suffering. And that takes energy. That takes a certain amount of energy. It's not just going to happen all on its own. One needs to be curious about the mind and curious about these processes. So that's just one form. I mean, there are more profound forms, where the mind is just too sleepy, or sometimes you're sick. Sometimes it manifests as a kind of boredom in the practice. So, but these are things that you should know for yourself and use that model of the hindrances to map out the obstructions to practice, and do that translation. So we have 10 minutes or so. Let me turn more to the comments. I see things scrolling by here. As always, lots of good cheer. Good to see everybody sharing Anjali. This we call Anjali. Sharing Anjali and good mornings and reports of the weather. Why is it we can't stop talking about the weather? Me myself, I'm talking about it every day. Good morning, good morning, good morning. So many good friends Is anyone feeling a little anticipatory sadness that the retreat is ending soon? Sunday. We only have today and tomorrow. I'm certainly going to miss Ajahns talks in the evening. They've just been beautiful, beautifully delivered, beautifully filmed. The audio quality is great. Well, I mostly see lots of good cheer and appreciation here. Let's see. I didn't mean for that bell to go. Let's see. So let's see, there's a comment here from Scott. I have met Dhamma geeks. That's so funny. Not a term I've heard. It's almost as if they want a strong stance to win philosophical debates rather than cultivating practice. Yeah, there is a tendency in some. See, Alexander, you're a poet and a writer, so you'll enjoy making your terminology for it. Good. Maybe you can share that with me. I still haven't really successfully come up with a term for greed. That's my kind of laziness. I've just befriended the word. Not completely, but it's a difficult one. Sense desire doesn't really seem to do it. Venerable Dhammadipa. Learn to read suttas like to imagine myself as the questioner and to hear the answer of the Buddha. It made it more personal for me. Yeah, that's nice. Also, Venerable Dhammadipa, I recommend both reading suttas out loud and also listening to them being read. As many have noted, they begin, "Thus have I heard." It was an oral tradition. And so, in some sense, the contents really wasn't meant to be read. I also sort of think that the whole form that the suttas evolved into are there, like part of the form is very functional. They are memory structures with error correction built into them, which is part of how the Dhamma has been preserved over such a long period of time, like hundreds of years in oral form before it was finally written down. And through various scholarship, there's very convincing evidence that that error correction worked amazingly well. I'm not of the mind that the suttas are perfect and complete, and that the Buddha said literally every word in the suttas. But the teachings themselves are internally very consistent, and one of the most interesting projects is the Agama project, where they are doing comparative studies between Chinese recensions of the suttas that were separated from the Pali Canon for 1,000 years, and the concordance between the two bodies of work is amazing. And there's a lot of problems that can creep into the telephone game over a 1,000-year period. So dedicated people really have preserved the Dhamma amazingly well. One thing to note, though, is oftentimes questions come up of a technical nature where we're seeking a kind of clarity in the words that we find in the sutta that just really aren't there. And part of it is the nature of the way the Buddha taught. It's a very contemplative and reflective teaching. And Ajahn referred to this in one of his talks on Vedana. There's a monk and a carpenter who are having this debate about the confusion that arises because the Buddha said there are two kinds of feelings and three kinds of feelings. Like, that's an example. But also there's many terms where if one looks at them very closely, they're not really well specified. And, we can, and if you listen to the way people talk, like language, spoken language and dialogue is not all that precise. It's not like legal documents or legal language. It's not even like a well-written textbook. The Buddha was meeting people, and he was meeting with monks, and he was having these exchanges and these dialogues, and he says things. And sometimes he throws out 2 or 3 words, as many do in a rhetorical style, to sort of help the listener connect. Like, it creates a kind of space for the contemplation to sort of catch up with the delivery of the speech. But also, sometimes 3 very closely related words help sort of connect one to the realm of meaning, rather than meaning being pinpoint and precise. And I don't think of the Dhamma as, there is amazing definition, and the Buddha defined his own words, but there's room for a little sloppiness in this. We're humans having a human experience of suffering, and if we take the Buddha's encouragement seriously and apply ourselves to trying to study and understand that, and understand why it is that these things arise and cease, and how it is we can act in more skillful ways, we can work this out for ourselves. It's not rocket science, and I think there's good criticism. There was many attempts to cast Buddhism as the most scientific of religions, and many people don't even consider it a religion. They think it's a philosophy. I think it's clearly a religion. Even a cursory study of the text supports this. The Buddha talks about it as a dispensation, as a sasana, as something very much like the way we think of religion. Excuse me. Okay, I'm just not able to keep up with 100 comments here today. So if people had questions that I've missed, I apologize. So obviously you're all attending to the chat and responding to each other. So, all right, well, we're approaching 8:30, so I'm going to be good to my word and keep this at a half hour today and go get a walk, get some fresh air and sunshine up on the trails of Burdoin Mountain. Thank you all for joining me this morning, and have a blessed day. Get in your meditation, and you have another half hour to submit questions for today's tea time Q&A session at 4 p.m. So if you have questions, submit them there, and we'll be selecting ones that focus in on this mindfulness of Dhamma categories, or the last section in particular. So keep that in mind when asking your questions. There'll be other opportunities for more general questions. I'm not going anywhere. So, and we'll see you on the streams later. So have a good day and put in some good effort today in your practice. And we'll see you tomorrow morning here for coffee. Bye for now.